Judy Cantor-Navas's career spans over 3 decades and touches every corner of the industry from local newspapers to Billboard, Disney, and now Substack. Starting out as a writer at the Associated Press, Judy had a passion for long-form articles and finding the next riveting story. Music journalism came at her at first as an assignment from her editor at the Associated Press. While it wasn't something she was particularly fond of initially or seen as a focus of her career long term, soon after it became the defining theme of her work. Thanks to a fellowship to write in Argentina, Judy began a fantastic career as a music journalist that led her to dozens of countries in Latin America and a consultant job that would land her clients at the highest levels of the journalistic hierarchy. I don't want to spoil too much from the interview, but I will say that if you like Encanto, then you're going to love hearing about Judy's work on it. Judy is disciplined, fabulously open-minded, and has a wealth of knowledge to share about the field of music journalism, writing in general, as well as Latin American music. Her Substack, Cuban Record, is centered around the story of Pinart Records, the first independent Cuban record company. Explore the pages of her Substack to unlock key, eyebrow-raising stories about the impact and sounds from the record label. Each week, you're in for a new discovery. Judy is someone I look up to, and if you consider yourself a music journalist or someone who is passionate about carving a career in writing, this interview is for you. So, without further ado, folks, here's my conversation with the Grammy Award nominated, award winning journalist and scriptwriter, Judy Cantor-Navas. Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the If Ever You're Listening podcast. I'm your host, Stanley C. And today we have a fantastic, legendary, historic guest calling, I should say, all the way from Madrid, Spain. And somebody I've read their work for a long time, and I really currently aspire to the stuff that they've accomplished, and it's really inspirational, the things that they've done, as I've spoken about in the intro of this video. But ladies and gentlemen, welcome Judy Cantor-Navas. Thank you for coming.
Hey Stanley, hi, I'm glad to be here.
So, Judy, I want to start with the beginning. We can go in 100 directions because your career has taken on 100 different forms, I should say. But I want to start before all of that, before even you started writing. Take us back to the beginning. I believe you're from New York, you're from the US,
Mhm.
but take us kind of to the start where did your relationship with music begin growing up, and kind of how did that meet your relationship with writing?
Hmm. Well, I think like a lot of people, it just began, going to concerts and being a kid, right? Being a teenager. I think, yeah. The first concert I actually went to was Santana
Nice.
when I was 12 or 13. At that time, my parents, I used to, at that time, I was already going out like to arena concerts and stuff.
Mhm. Mhm.
I don't know if I would have let frankly, if I would have let my son do that when he was that age, I probably would be like, oh, I'm going to. But, my parents were like, whatever. They didn't even know what I was doing. But I think that was, this was, when was that? Like sometime in the 70s. So I think that was typical at the time. Yes, I was more like into rock and, everything that was happening at that time. And as far as writing, I really always wanted to be a journalist.
Mhm.
And for a while I wasn't sure. And then I went to NYU. I
Mhm.
did study journalism and I ended up working for the Associated Press in New York City, which was great, quite young. And I knew I used to, which was great, as everybody says, it was great training as a journalist. But then I knew I used to have to really do like the beat, like the kind of calling the police
Yeah.
every hour to see what was happening and getting out there and covering a few murders and things like that. And I realized that really wasn't what I wanted to do. And I was also lucky because at that time, the serious and older journalists, they didn't want to do, entertainment.
Yeah.
And so when bands would come to town, they'd be like, "Oh, let Judy do it." So,
Mm,
so that was how I started writing about music, actually. Yeah.
what?
And yeah, and then I ended up getting like a fellowship to go to Buenos Aires.
Hmm.
And yeah, and so I just continued with that, with writing about music down there. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, I want to pause us in like three-fourths of the way of what you were just describing. Thank you, Judy, for describing that journey for you when you're maybe at NYU or at the Associated Press, whichever one this where this happened. Who were some of your journalistic inspirations, if you had any, or who were any of the music writing journalists or writers that you knew, magazines maybe that you've read at the time that you were using maybe as models or anything to aspire to?
Yeah. Well, I love Joan Didion. I love kind of the new journalism,
Hmm.
called it at the time. And I read The Village, I lived in the Village. I read The Village Voice,
Hmm.
um, 7 Days, which was another one that existed for a short time. All of these kind of weeklies that were out there, a little bit more counterculture, because, by the time I was in college, um, I was going out to places in the East Village and there was just a lot of funky things going on. And I don't know, I don't really remember so much. Of course, I read a lot of journalism for my classes.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't really remember at that time being so much into music writing as just into writing, you know?
Yeah.
Or like even things like the New Yorker. So yeah, I was always interested in long form, even though that wasn't what I was doing in the beginning.
Got it.
Mhm.
So you get a fellowship, you go to Buenos Aires.
Mhm.
I believe you're writing for the Herald in Buenos
Mhm.
Aires.
Mhm.
And what is that experience like? What are you learning? What does it feel like? Because you're still early in your career.
Yeah, I was like 22 at that point. And I had studied in like semester abroad in Spain, so I spoke some Spanish, but that was where I became fluent in Spanish. But it was an amazing time because it was really at the beginning of the democracy in Argentina after the whole, military regime, the horrible, dirty war, where really a generation was kind of decimated because they had either left the country or they had been killed,
Mhm.
or they were so traumatized
Hmm.
after that. So there was a new younger generation coming up, which were kind of like they didn't want to talk about it anymore. And that was where there was this whole like cultural explosion happening.
Hmm.
So, and a lot of that took the form of rock music but a certain what for me was a very particular sound that they had. I used to kind of get very angry and still do, not very angry, but whatever, annoyed
Hmm.
that people say, that Latin American music, rock music, or other sorts of music is derivative, that they're just trying to do American music because I don't believe that.
Hmm.
So it was fascinating because these kids were also really pushing the boundaries, but really in a way that I had never experienced because there were kind of real risks involved and you know, they were just really forging kind of a new identity that to me was fascinating. Yeah, changed my life.
Wonderful. And for your career, the trajectory from there, there seems to be, at least from what I've seen, a kind of this overall umbrella of Latin music. And we're gonna get to kind of Cuban music because it seems to be that's where the heart is later. But talk to me about because after this, I believe you go to Miami,
Mhm.
or Miami shows up soon after this, and you're writing for the Miami Time, New Times, and then Herald, and all these fantastic newspapers. What are some of the skills you're developing at this time as a writer? Both maybe like hard skills, but also maybe more social skills.
Mhm. Well, obviously, some of the skills were, translating, and I'm not only talking about the language. I'm talking about, I guess, a cultural translation,
Yep.
or even music, kind of explaining, which I don't do as much today, but I think then in many cases for the American publications I was writing for, there was a real need to be explaining even, what these different rhythms were.
Hmm.
In the case of Buenos Aires, okay, people know what, they know the word, the tango, but maybe they don't, when you're writing. And also, I was encouraged by my editors always to do that, to give, more of an explanation so that people know what you're talking about, obviously, which I think is important. I think today with the pervasiveness of Latin music, a lot more people, of course, they're familiar with a term like salsa,
Hmm.
but I think in many cases you want to explain or also show the point. I'm always, of course, interested in showing the point of view
Hmm.
of these musicians or these audiences that I'm talking about. I mean, I'm not going to talk for them. So always, I'm always interviewing people. I'm always describing, I love going to places and I like physical descriptions a lot. Um, but really to bring people there, that's always really important to me as well, and say things from the point of view who are, making the music or living the life, that's very important to me. I'm not going to talk for them.
And that's really profound because especially now, more and more writers in America are trying to describe genres of completely different countries, completely different cultures, and a lot of the times they're doing it without actually going to those cultures or not being from those cultures. And so there is this kind of in this push and pull of trying to describe something, trying to understand it, but trying to give a voice to someone else. And I feel like your work does that really well, and your career shows that really well. Um, when I remember when I was first reading your work, I was like, wait, is she from Cuba? Like where is the Cuba part coming from? It's called Cuba on Record, and then I kept reading it, and then I kept learning about all this cool stuff with Cuba, and then I found out all the background you have with Latin America, all the people, all the interviews you've done, and there's just this real honesty, this real connection to the roots of the culture that is really important to describe this type of to do this type of writing. Um, so along your career you start to have clients and you become a consultant. And these are not for the listener, if this is the first time you're hearing of Judy, these are not, low stakes clients. These are NPR, these are Disney, these are uh, great magazines like No Depression, and the list goes very, very deep. Can you talk a little bit about, as a writer, as a journalist, because a lot of my listeners are also journalists, how how do you maintain or sustain these relationships with your clients, and in what ways do you build trust with them?
Mm. Well, I think trust comes from, I mean, that could be obvious, but just working very hard, I really, that's just, and I don't really do it, for them. I do it for me. That's just the way that I am because I want something that I write, yeah, to go deep. I want to, get all of the information. I do a lot of listening.
Hmm.
Like I say, I remember, um, I think it was when I was working at Billboard and I was, the managing editor of Billboard in Espanol. And one of the younger writers who worked for me, I said to her, look, you just have to listen to an album until you want to throw up, and then maybe you're gonna, because you've listened to it so many times, so many times. And she kind of looked at me like I was nuts. But for me, that's just like a normal thing to do, to just keep listening because, of course, the first time you listen to something, of course, you're not ready to write about it. So, just that. Anyway, I'm getting away from the subject, but I meet my deadlines. I communicate. I mean, these seem like obvious things, but maybe sometimes they're not to some people, right? And these were things that, editors train me to do. Like, I'll always be very grateful to my editor at the Miami New Times, Jim Mullen, because he used to say to me, you have to have a thick skin.
Hmm.
You go out and do your job. You're not there to make friends or, you're not there to make nice. And if you're a critic and you don't like something, you can't be afraid to tell your opinion because maybe next time, they're not going to give you the concert tickets or they're not going to do this or that. Um, so that was very important to me. And that's something that I'm still reminded of a lot, to have a thick skin. And today with social media, I think, that must be for people starting out, that must be worse because it's like you post things and then everybody's out there with their comments. And a lot of times just making the comments just to be haters or whatever.
Yeah.
So those things are very important. And I think to me, I guess that's what's made me a good professional and people have appreciated that, I get my stuff in on deadline. I try and do something that people are gonna want to read.
Hmm.
Um, and in other kinds of work, I mean, it's the same thing. I don't know. I don't think about it too much, but I just do the best I can, and really get into it, and maybe even more than I need to, you know. So
No, that's great advice. And I think that's important because as you're going and you're writing, and this is for the listener, as you're continuing to create your own voice as a writer and your own kind of style, there's a lot of maybe personality that goes into it or ego that goes into it, and you kind of forget that a lot of work, you have to really just put in a lot of work and not be as sensitive about small things. And building a thick skin, I think, is something that people forget to have. I think it's easy to get emotional now, but I think it's a good thing to have thick skin because it allows you to focus on what the overall goal of whatever project you're working on or essay or paper you're working on. So I think that's great advice. The next thing I wanted to talk about is one of your consultants is Disney, and it wasn't one of the projects you worked on was a little film called Encanto. So I wanted to hear your experience as a cultural consultant with Encanto. Kind of how did that come about? What was your experience like, and how did you feel about the finished product? I could run off all the accolades the film got and the soundtrack got. The records are broke, but how was it for you?
yeah,
And
that was an amazing experience for me. I mean, a lot of things that come to me aren't really things that I'm looking for. Just, you know, people recommend me for things. So that was, something that I hadn't expected to do, but I really, really enjoyed. And basically, it was about They called me cultural music consultant, which I
Mhm.
love that. I think that really sums up what I do really well. So, and the idea was basically to talk to the directors and also, some of the team about Latin music.
Mhm.
Of course they had to create this world, and so they not only me, but they, as they do for their films at Disney Animation, they kind of have this what do they call it? Like a cultural brain trust, who's,
Mhm.
yeah, like one person's talking to them about, what clothing are they going to be wearing, physically what does the landscape look like, they of course they want to be very accurate in that way. I think before they're going to take it to more of an artistic level, they need that base. So we were just talking about Latin American music from different countries. Basically, that was how it started out. Basically, they were kind of lectures on music from different countries that I was doing, which I really, really enjoyed. And then I was making a lot of playlists. And like can you imagine like the animators listening to my playlist while they're working? And that was just such a
So
wonderful
cool.
thing for me. So I enjoyed that a lot. And then, as it went on, at the end, I got to work with the music department a little bit, and just, I don't know, for just certain specific things. And I got to listen to a lot of the music early on, which was amazing. So yeah, that was a great experience and got me kind of much more interested into things like music supervision and that kind of work as well.
Well, thank you for your work on that because the music on there was fantastic. And I was playing that soundtrack a lot a couple of years ago when
Oh,
it came out. So I was
yeah,
finding out when I found out you worked on that.
yeah, I have a credit, in the movie. I'm so excited by that. I know for a lot of people that's kind of an everyday thing, but not for me. I was like really excited to see that when I went with my family to see the movie at the theater.
That's awesome. That is so cool. I didn't even think of that. Yeah, so you would have seen your name at the end of the movie. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Speaking of things most people don't experience and you've experienced in terms of credit, you've also been Grammy nominated for being on the liner notes of a very established and accomplished and accolade-filled Cuban box set of Cuban music, um, which is really cool. I was listening to that before this and talk to me about how did that opportunity come about and how because this feels even more aligned with the work that you were doing prior. Is this something you were expecting, or was it some like
Yeah.
Disney one
That
that came
actually,
to your plate?
no, that actually came more from me
Cool.
because what happened was this is called the Complete Cuban Jam Sessions. And this is music from the Cuban record label Panart, which
Mhm.
was the first independent Cuban record label. This has, we can talk about after, has a lot to do with my Substack. Um, and so for some years, I had been investigating that, starting with one article that I did.
Mhm.
Um, and then kind of just, yeah, unraveling the mystery of what was this label that just disappeared. In
Mhm.
any case, through a series of factors, the catalog of the Pan Art label was acquired by Concord Records. And so when I found that out, I wrote to, I believe, like the vice president of Concord. I can't remember exactly what position he was in at that time. But anyway, and I think on LinkedIn, and he wrote me back, I basically said to him, if you guys are going to be doing some things with this label and reissues, I can help you because I
Mhm.
know all about it. So he actually wrote me back, and I was able to, spend some time with them and work with them. And these are kind of these legendary jam sessions, most of which were recorded in Havana. There are five of them.
Mm.
So they wanted to put them together into a box set, and they asked me to write the liner notes and to co-produce it. And yeah, it's really beautiful, and historically it's just really interesting. And it's great because I was able at that time to find two musicians who actually participated. But the box set came out, and it was a total surprise to me that I was nominated for the Grammy. These are great, actually, all you writers out there. These are, it's such a wonderful Grammy category. And I always write about it too every year because it's not for the record, it's for the writer. So it's really cool. So I was really felt so privileged to be nominated for that. Yeah.
Well, well earned, and when I was reading about it, it felt like a lifetime achievement for all the music writing you've done, and it's it's great that the Grammys have that category. Hopefully, they increase the number of categories for the writers. Um, another thing, there's two directions I want to take this. I almost want to go right into the Substack part because we're talking about Cuba, and to go into Cuba on record. But I want to hold that for a preface question, which is more about because you mentioned interviewing a few folks, and having conversations with them and being in Cuba. A lot of your work has involved travel. You've spoken at conferences, universities, and you're an expert in what you do. How has travel and being able to get firsthand experiences with the musicians been for you? And maybe what are some of your most memorable travel experiences when it comes to this work?
Hmm. Yeah, for me, that's really been key, to what I do. For me, as I said before, like the most important thing when I'm talking about music, I really, yes, is to talk to the people who are making the music and know not only about the music, but knowing their stories. Like to me personally, that is just what is so fascinating about what I do. And, I always say that I get like, I've gotten so many life lessons, from being somebody who's always talking to people for my profession, but it's been so important to me. Um, so yeah, I guess as far as travel, Cuba has been very important, and that's something that happened way back now. And the first time I went to Cuba in 1993, because I had gone to live in Miami. Um, and of course, as soon as I got there, became very curious because everybody's talking about Cuba all the time. And I was kind of like, well, I need to go to Cuba. And my editor was kind of like, well, nobody really goes to Cuba to write a music story. That's not really happening. He said, if you can get a visa, you can go. And I did. That really, it wasn't such an issue. I mean, I had to ask from the Cuban interest section, and they were great. They actually set up a whole tour for me. And so on that particular trip, I had gone once before, but then I did a trip that was really talking about what was the music that was happening in
Mm.
Cuba, what were the trends and all of that, and the story behind them. So that was very, very important because that really set me up there as far as all of the contacts with all of these bands. And really until today, even those early experiences that I had in Cuba, I mean, I'm still in contact with a lot of the same people. So it's amazing. Yeah.
Wow, that's so cool. And that's an even better transition into your Substack. So Judy has a Substack called Cuba on Record. I was going to say podcast, phenomenal Substack. Check it out, subscribe to it, follow it. But talk to me about the decision to join Substack. It's still a relatively new platform for writers. More and more people are coming to it every year, every month. You already were established before Substack, kind of we before the podcast started, me and Judy were talking about kind of the change in music journalism over the years. So maybe that might be I should frame this question is in your from your experience in music journalism, how have you seen things change and kind of what did the decision to join Substack mean to you?
Okay. Well, I've seen things, of course, change so much, from, of course, on the newspaper side, of course, there's a lot less staff writers covering music. A lot of the music magazines have gone down too. And I think a lot from what I've seen, even within that, there's a lot more pressure when you're at a publication to maybe write in a certain way or write about certain things. Even we're talking about the what are the priorities of the record labels
Hmm.
and things like that, which is not really where I'm coming from. So I was working for Billboard for, gosh, like 13 years. That's amazing. But and I was doing that in the States, in New York and in LA as a staff writer. And then I decided to move to Spain with my family. Actually, my husband is from Barcelona. We live in Barcelona, which, yeah, no, I know
Apologies.
on the Zoom it says Madrid, but it's actually Barcelona.
Cool, cool. Even better.
Yeah, I
Even
know
better.
I thought that. Um, And then I still continued to work, more as a freelancer until 2020. And then during the pandemic, they kind of, whatever. These are things that happen with these companies, especially when you have a lot of new owners coming in and
Yeah.
they're always changing things. So at my point, we kind of decided to part ways. Um, and I've been doing well, obviously doing other things since then, more freelance. But really, I think it's becoming a full-time freelancer for the first time.
Mm,
I've always had staff jobs,
yep.
and done other things at the same time that I've had the staff jobs. But anyway, I worked on a podcast for Audible called Punk in Translation, which I think is really great, and I encourage people, not just because I worked on it, but I encourage people to check it out. Just basically about Latinos in punk, but very different stories, like ranging from like the 60s to the present. It's not really about a certain movement, it's just about Latino representation or people who happen to be Latinos or somehow involved with the punk movement. Um, anyway, okay, so I've been doing this and that. And then I have a book project, which is called Cuba on Record, which is about Pan Art, the first Cuban record label, and the rise and fall of this record label, which was very, very successful, not only in Cuba, but in the United States, and in other places in the world. And then suddenly it just disappeared. Um, so that's the basic premise of the book. And as I say, it's a project I've been working on for a while. And so I started reading Substack pretty recently, I guess like last year.
Hmm.
And like many people, I kind of got hooked up with Substack through Ted Gioia. I mean,
Hmm.
not that I know him, but I started reading his Substack. And then I saw that some people were publishing their books on Substack. And I was kind of in the middle of like, oh, okay, well, should I start sending out the book proposals? And then I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to try doing this on Substack. And so on my Substack, I'm publishing chapters of the book. I have, well, three, a prologue and two chapters up right now. But then I'm writing about a lot of other things about Cuban music, and kind of as the title says, it's mostly about, recorded Cuban music from really, I don't know, from the past century to the present.
Yeah.
Um, but it's also about Latin music in general. It's about, everything that maybe somehow is connected to Cuban music. Like last week, I was writing about the producer Norman Granz
Mhm.
and, the jazz music and the Pablo Records label, which I love. So I'm basically, I write a lot about, I guess, social history, music history, social history. And yeah, so it's been, I think, like a lot of people, you kind of start out and you're just kind of doing what you want to do. It's not like I started out with such a plan besides that I wanted to publish the book there. So little by little, I started in October. So it's been a few months and yeah, I'm enjoying it so far.
Well, it's really fun to read. It's I every week I'm learning something new. I For the listener, one of my favorite articles on there is you wrote about Roomba, I believe, in Central Park and like the history
Mhm.
of like these live Roomba kind of get-togethers and that date back to the 60s. It was I'm like I didn't know about this and I like work in New York. So really cool stuff like that. There's so many really cool twists and turns, collaborations with Bad Bunny, or the collaborators of Bad Bunny's new project. It's a chock full of fun. If you like music discovery, check it out. If you like, and when the book comes out, um, I'm pre-ordering it. So that one that can't come out soon enough. The following questions I have, I call this section of the interview the If Ever You're Listening question. So we're on the If Ever You're Listening podcast. And like the title suggests, I'm curious about what you're listening to. What is on your playlist, Judy? So that's the first question. There's four questions. The first one is, what are you listening to these days? What has struck your fancy, maybe in the past, maybe so far in 2025?
Hmm. Well, like always, I'm listening to a lot of archival music. So that can really, a lot of Latin music. Again, a lot of I just actually just did, my latest chapter was called Havana in Harlem. So I was listening to a lot of music from the 1930s in New York, a Cuban guy called Alberto Socoras, and his band, Puerto Rican musicians from that time. And believe it or not, I've been listening to lately music from like the end of the Spanish composers from the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century,
Like
which
it.
yeah, I was doing a lecture at the Picasso Museum here in Barcelona.
Mhm.
So these were things that were connected with an exhibition there. We're talking about, Enrique Granados, uh, Pablo Casals. So I'm probably going to be doing a playlist on the Substack, which this is something different. It's all about kind of the image of Spain
Mm,
through music, which is something that started, way back in the 1800s, but continues to today with somebody like Rosalia.
true.
So, yeah.
Wow. Oh, I love this. Wow.
This kind of idea of Spain as being, about flamenco,
Mhm.
about, this image of southern Spain,
Mm,
of bullfights and, things like that, and how that's reflected in the music.
fascinating.
Anyway, so that's something I've been listening to.
That's so cool. Yeah, yeah. Those are great and also disparate genres, disparate
Yeah.
artists. Fascinating.
But
Okay. Yeah,
every Stanley, I really find more and more that everything connects.
it does.
So that's
Yeah.
something I just love that. And that's one thing that I love and that I write about a lot is connections and unexpected things.
Mm,
I love that.
fantastic. Same. Same. You're preaching to the choir. My second question is, and this is going to be an interesting question for you because you've written so much, but I'm very curious what you would say to this question. So, from your career, let's go all the way back, as far back as you can go to the present. Kind of in that collection of articles and papers and maybe even works, not just written work, but maybe even podcast episodes. What are some of your maybe like top three most underrated or underappreciated pieces of work that you've worked on in your career?
Oof, I don't know.
That's tough.
Okay, I'm going to relate this to Substack
Hmm.
because in my career, usually, I've been lucky in that, people seem to like what I do. And so I'll get compliments, or when I worked at newspapers, get some letters to the editor or whatever. But to live in a world where you're looking at like what are the stats and
Yeah.
how many people are reading it, I mean, I just have to be honest, I am not used to that. And I
Mm,
am really used to working on an article, working on whatever project, and then kind of on to the next thing. And I think that that's one aspect, one way that things have really changed a lot because I think well, I guess it's different, of course, if you're writing books and you see, how many books have I sold? I mean, that was never my case. I've always been writing, for articles or even like if I'm like, um, I was working, I told you a lot for streaming services
mhm.
before, but it's not like I was ever looking how many people are listening to these songs I'm writing about because, or whatever, because that this was never part of my job. We had a big kind of division, that whole division between church and state that has gotten a lot, between the business and art,
Yeah.
right? Which, has come together a lot more really out of survival, of
Yeah.
course, because if you're going to be a writer, an artist, you have to be more conscious of those things. So that's why I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question
Mhm.
because it's not something I've ever thought about it. But
Mm,
you know what? If I was worrying, I mean, of course, like on Substack, maybe I'm seeing now I'm being a little, I'm more
yeah.
conscious of it because I'm looking at the stats and sometimes, yeah, I'm like, okay, well, this article did well, so maybe I should do more things like that.
Mhm.
But, mm, and I would know kind of which of my articles were more popular, but I can't say that that ever really influenced
Yeah.
what other things that I would do so much,
Mhm. Yeah.
I just
My-
kind of go by instinct. And
mm,
yeah, hopefully people want to read it. Hopefully someone appreciates it. In some cases, I'm happy when if it's the person who I write about, if it means something to actually something that I have seen is how things that I've written have affected people's careers
mm,
in some cases. And, that makes me happy. If it's somebody who, I mean, it's not why I write the story, right? But if it happens, um, that's been kind of a surprise and just being like, oh, okay, that's cool. Because I'm not, I should say that I'm not a celebrity writer at all. Like I often write about people artists who are not so well known, or people who used to be well known and they're not anymore. And I enjoy that a lot. But anyway, I don't think I can answer that question.
No, you've answered it. I think you answered it very well, Judy. The your answer is a testament to the change in music journalism over the years. I think it was actually a good perspective to have because you were noting how the underrated whole idea of having an underrated article wasn't even in your like view, it wasn't even in your worldview because it was you drop an article, the editors do what they may, it's out, you move on to the next one. Now you have a deadline. You have 7 days to do the so you didn't have time to, not that you didn't have time, but there wasn't a you get called the next week, we got 20 hits on this article. Good
Yeah,
job.
like,
It's
yeah,
you got two letters in the mail. They like your article. And it's like great.
right.
And so I love that answer actually. It's good to remember that stuff because it doesn't have to, and this is going to bleed very nicely into my next question. It doesn't have to be this current way. It could change. Which
Hmm.
is my next question, which is and from your experience, um, and seeing the current kind of music journalism industry, if you will. If you had like a magic wand, or if a genie showed up in the middle of the day and was like, you have only one wish, if you could change anything about the current music journalism industry, what would it be and why?
Okay, I definitely would want more magazines to come back, whatever form those are going to take, print or digital. And I would love it if they were print. Um, and also in at jobs for music journalists at newspapers. I'm talking really on the local level because I think that's so important. And it's also, we were talking a little bit about being able to just go out and report on concerts or scenes or getting together with artists. And that's so important. And a big part of that is when you have your local scene, and that also helps you to see a bigger picture. And without that, I don't know. I don't know where we're going without that because it's great to talk about you do get a lot of music. You do have access to a lot of music, and that's great too. And, for me, that's really important because what I do is a lot with archival music. So, of course, that's really important to be able to sit here and just access all of this music and fit it together, into the history that I'm writing about. Um, but yes, if I had a magic wand, I really would really want these jobs for music journalists to come back. And
Yes.
jobs kind of with what we're talking about, jobs where, you're getting out there and you're writing and you're listening to music and you're going to hear stuff and you're getting paid for it and you're not worrying about, how am I going to pay the rent? Because you have this job and all you can do is or all you want to do and all you have to do is just be experiencing the music and really spending a lot of time thinking about it and writing about it. So that was what I would like. I don't know how that could happen really, but
I mean, it can happen in a way where the this is one way I could see it end up happening there because there's so many now independent music journalists over time. A few of them get really big, and instead of staying these like, and it's kind of like what happens with independent musicians. They become independent and then they get really big and then they sign to a label. An independent journalist could start become as big as Pitchfork or Stereogum or Billboard,
exactly.
and then they get bought by Billboard, and then they just write.
Right.
They become like the lead columnist or the editor. So I think that can happen. I hope something like that. But I do miss the physical. Like I think No Depression still has a physical magazine,
Yeah,
and
love no depression. So
it's
whenever
so great.
I can, yeah, write about that with for them, I do.
Yeah.
Um,
The local part, I think that was your emphasis. So local, making sure the
yeah,
local newspapers are highlighted.
yeah, like when I lived in Miami, which was a really high point in my career, that was it. I mean, I was just out there discovering things and finding things out, and yeah, it was amazing. And, I love to pay attention to somebody who maybe, nobody's writing about, and to be in that position to go out and search for that, because that was what my editors wanted too. So, anyway, I will say with what you're saying that I think, yeah, people are in a way doing this on Substack because people are just doing things for their niche, and a lot of people are like, I'm writing what I want to write,
Mhm.
right? And I don't care. And that's that. And then people, they find out that people really like it and they have all these subscribers. So that's a beautiful thing, you know?
Yeah, it is. It is. We're in a beautiful part of it is very beautiful, and then part of it
Mhm.
is there. We did lose something to gain this, but we could gain it back. My last question is about advice. So, and you were kind of talking about kind of good tips in an earlier question that your editor would give you. Um, but maybe outside of that advice, maybe even more big picture advice, wider lens advice. What is the best piece of advice you've been given in your career that's really formed the way you think about your work and your journey?
I guess for me, not really being told something, but besides what I told you about having a thick skin, but just really being encouraged to get out there, and not even really thinking, can I do this or can I do that, but just going out and doing it because, of course, you don't know until you try. So, so just being, yeah, so just being open and not, I don't know, not having expectations really about what you have to do and just feeling it out. And also that has to do for me with like, I think that you need to have a good base for your writing, and hopefully you're going to be able to get that training. But beyond that, um, just kind of discovering what works for you and letting your style develop, right? Because it will. And you have to work hard, but just getting out there, I think is really important, you know. Getting out there physically, if you're not going to get out there physically, listening to a lot of music and also not expecting everything to be perfect, I think is always good advice because some things that you write are going to be better than others, and that's fine. So I don't know if that made sense, but
It, I think that was great advice. I'm going to
okay.
take a bit of that home with me. I hope the listener does as well. But Judy, thank you so much for coming to the podcast. You're a gem, you're an inspiration, and your perspective is important to have, especially in as the climate and music journalism continues to change. Continue to make beautiful art, beautiful work, and I'm excited for the the future release of Cuba on Record. But in the meantime, I'm excited for the next the next week of Cuba on Record Substack post, and I know you're going to work on something soon. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much, Stanley. That was great. I really enjoyed it.